One man with the right connections, the right timing, and the right weaknesses in a system turned the Kenyan economy on its head. He was charming, calculated, and invisible when it mattered the most. Yagnesh Devani, once a quiet businessman, would go on to orchestrate one of Kenya's most audacious corporate heists. Over 120 million liters of fuel disappeared, and just when it was about to be discovered, he vanishes with billions. This is not fiction. This is a Triton Oil Scandal, one of the boldest disasters to ever hit East Africa. The year was 2008. Kenya's energy sector was thriving. The country was heavily reliant on petroleum imports to power transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and virtually every part of daily life. International oil prices were surging, and oil marketing companies were raking in the profits. Among the giants like Shell, Total, and Kenyan Kobil, a small company named Triton Petroleum had quietly entered the scene. Very few people noticed it, and even fewer people knew of its existence. Founded by a businessman named Yagnesh Devani, Triton was barely a player in the market, controlling less than 1% of Kenyan's oil trade. It didn't even have the infrastructure, market reach, or even visibility of its competitors and big players at that time. But Devani, being an ambitious man, had a plan. A plan to rise and become the biggest player in the Kenyan oil business. Triton gained access to Kenya Pipeline Company system, which managed the storage and distribution of imported petroleum products in Kenya. And this is how the business was set up. Triton operated under a collateral financing agreement (CFA) with various financiers. Banks such as Kenyan Commercial Bank (KCB), Fortis Bank, Emirates National Oil Company (ENOC), and Glencore would finance Triton's imports. The fuel would then be stored in the depots of the Kenyan Pipeline Company (KPC). Under these CFA terms, the fuel technically belonged to the banks, as collateral. This was until Triton paid back the loans it had from the financiers. And as such, KPC was not supposed to release the fuel without written authorization from the financiers, that is the financing banks. But wait, given how small Triton was, it was an unusual achievement for such a small company. It was even more surprising that Triton even obtained storage capacity and clearance to import oil using borrowed money from multiple banks. Of course, this is because of its lack of a track record that banks would normally insist on to finance such a project. Triton may be a small company, but what people did not realize was that Devani wasn't just another guy off the streets trying to make it in the Kenyan business world. His family owned Devani Oil, which had been in Kenya's fuel trade for years. So while Triton was new, he wasn't. Actually, several key things played to his favor and played it well. He had industry credibility from his family background, a polished profile as a well-spoken, educated businessman, and connections within government and finance, which we will see how they come in handy to save him every moment in his life. Again, Devani also charmed his way into KPC. Normally, KPC would not offer large storage space for such a tiny company. But in Devani's case, it said that he secured large capacity allocations even though they were way more than Triton needed. This was his way of showing economies of scale so he can win favor with KPC. Another thing that may have helped Devani was in the shadows there were unverified KPC insider claims that some staff were pressured from above to give him access. These were also backed with rumors of bribes and political favors flying around to lubricate the deal. In short, Devani had friends in high places. And these factors were actually very vital in convincing the banks to support his endeavors. So having leveled the ground with KPC, he went to the banks with signed contracts, inventory at KPC, and a polished, impeccable business image. His success on paper was impressive for the banks. More so because banks love familiarity, they saw Devani as a safe bet. All said and done, Devani, the banks, and KPC got into a deal. However, between late 2007 and early 2009, something sinister started to happen. Triton began quietly lifting petroleum products from KPC storage without the required bank approvals. These weren't small amounts. We are talking about taking small amounts from hundreds of millions of liters. So it obviously went unnoticed for too long. And by the time it was discovered, more than 126 million liters of petroleum products had been illegally released to Triton. That amount of fuel alone could keep Kenya's road transport running for months. It caught the banks off guard. They had not issued any release instructions, but the fuel was gone. When they asked KPC for explanations, the company had none. Documentation was missing, signatures were forged, some approvals did not even exist. It turned out that some KPC employees had colluded with Devani and his company to facilitate the release of oil without verification or paperwork. Internal controls were bypassed with ease. There were no alarms, no audits, nothing. It was then said that Devani would sell this fuel in the local market at market rates. He cashed in all the profits and walked away without paying or involving the banks. This unfortunately left the banks with billions in non-performing loans. And just as soon as the banks launched an investigation on Devani, he vanished. A scandal like this would not have happened without powerful connections, or rather, friends in high places. And Devani had plenty. As investigations unfolded, distributing links to high-ranking government officials emerged. Reports indicated that senior officials in the Ministry of Energy had been leaning on KPC to expedite Triton's fuel releases. There were instances where orders to bypass the financials were disguised as emergency government requests. As investigations proceeded, familiar names came up, including permanent secretaries and former ministers in the energy sector. However, everyone mentioned denied involvement, and this is despite leaked memos and testimonies suggesting that Triton had political backing that allowed it to act with impunity. At the same time, internal whistleblowers revealed that KPC board members and mid-level managers had received kickbacks to authorize illegal fuel releases. Triton was not just a rogue company, it was a vehicle being used to funnel fuel and sometimes money to networks beyond the oil industry. By December 2008, the scam began to unravel in public. The banks started demanding their fuel back. They sent auditors to KPC depot to verify the inventories, and what they found shocked them. The tanks were completely empty. KCB alone had over 2 billion Kenya shillings tied to the fuel that no longer existed. Fortis Bank, Emirate Banks, Glencore all posted enormous losses. In total, more than 7.6 billion Kenya shillings worth of petroleum products had disappeared. The loss sent shockwaves in the entire country. Fuel shortages hit Kenya hard. Prices at the pump soared. Transporters suffered. The economy took a very great hit. Public outrage then followed as people questioned the inflation caused by fuel, and Parliament started demanding answers. But the person with the answers, Devani, had vanished. Authorities scrambled to locate Devani. He was rumored to be in the UK, but nobody knew for sure at this point. So the Interpol got involved and it issued a red notice for his arrest. But the hunt for Devani would drag for more than a decade. He was later found in the UK, but it is said that the court proceedings in the UK delayed his extradition to Kenya for years. He actually tried to play the court system to delay his case, citing issues like poor health, lack of fair trial guarantees in Kenya, and other legal loopholes just to avoid being sent back to Kenya. Meanwhile, back here in Kenya, the justice system dealt with the scandal clumsily, to say the least. The KPC managers who approved the releases of the oil were suspended, but very few were ever convicted. Some fled the country, while some were reinstated quietly years later. The lack of straightforwardness in the case made the public as well as the banks lose hope for full justice. The Triton scandal faded from the headlines quietly, but the debt it left behind was too loud for the banks to ignore. In January 2024, in a dramatic turn of events, Devani was finally extradited to Kenya. Apparently, his many cases to challenge extradition to Kenya were dismissed in the UK courts, and this was after 15 years as a fugitive in the UK. As soon as he landed on Kenyan soil, the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, EACC, pounced on him immediately, arraying him before the courts in Nairobi under tight security. This wasn't just about fuel anymore, it was about accountability. EACC charged Devani with 19 counts of fraud, including conspiracy to defraud and stealing mortgaged petroleum products. Devani's charge sheet was so long because it included over 318,656 metric tons of fuel jet, 2,000 metric tons of gas oil, 418 metric tons of petroleum motor spirit, 12,782 metric tons of automatic gas oil, and many other products which were all missing, and they all traced back to Triton. The case is still going on in court, and it's about mid-2024. The Director of Public Prosecution suddenly introduces a motion to attempt to drop some of the charges, citing unavailable witnesses. At first, the High Court intervened, demanding that the full trial proceeds. But the Director of Public Prosecution proceeded to argue that key witnesses that comprised of a former energy minister were reluctant to testify, while other witnesses were missing or dead. This disclosure watered down the case, leading to the magistrate allowing the withdrawal of the case in accordance to Section 87A of the Criminal Procedure Code of Kenya, which, if it helps, provides room for prosecuting Devani in future should any new evidence arise in the case. But at that moment, Devani's case was withdrawn. And just like that, after pulling off a massive economic shakedown and fleeing for 15 years, Devani walks a free man. As we stand today, not a single coin lost in the scandal has been recovered. And possibly, Kenyans are still footing the cost of the damage the Triton scandal inflicted in the economy. Meanwhile, the banks wrote off the losses, KPC moved on, but this part of Kenyan economic history remains stained forever.